Sheri, you can say a little bit more about yourself as well before you get going with your presentation. So I know and met Sheri online actually through another colleague of mine, Professor Maureen Reid, who's at the University of Saskatchewan, who's collaborate with on several different projects. And we just met online and we got chatting, and I just thought, wow, you're doing really interesting work, and it'll be very relevant to the master's session that we had this morning on vulnerability assessment. So Sheri then very kindly said she would come and talk to you about her work. And I think what's different from all the examples we looked at this morning is that Sheri is working with industry. So she's working with forest industry. So with the private sector, and I guess public sector as well, in the Canadian context, but also in the context of, vulnerable Indigenous communities. So the First Nations communities who also own and manage forestry lands in Canada. So Sheri has her own small NGO, I guess. It's the Innovative Climate Strategies, and I did share a link to the website, and you can see the type of work she was doing there. She's also associated with the University of British Columbia, UBC, which is in Vancouver, around there. And she's the program director for climate vulnerability and adaptation there. And then she's also associated with the University of Saskatchewan and leads on the climate change certificate. And she's also been doing a lot of curriculum development around these particular courses, which I think is they're aimed at a broad audience, I understand, Sheri. So it's not just students, but it includes practitioners and industry owners, government officials, etc. But I'll hand over to you now to say a little bit more and then take us through your presentation. Thanks very much for being with us. I think it's 8 o'clock in the morning there. So we're very lucky to have Sheri. I'm sure she just dropped her kids at school and is now sitting at a computer ready to talk to you. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you very much, Fiona, and thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to join you today. And yes, it's 8 o'clock or shortly after 8 here, so I automatically want to say good morning, but I guess it's good afternoon there. And yeah, I'm so pleased to be here and join you today to share some of the great work that I've been fortunate enough to be involved in Canada, and we've also collaborated on projects around large-scale vulnerability work with the U.S. Forest Service in Western U.S. in Oregon and Northern California and Washington State. So it's exciting work that I get to be a part of. I have actually been doing this work in the climate change arena and forestry for over 25 years now. And, when I first started in the climate change end of things, there wasn't a lot of uptake, especially in an industry context, or even actually in Canada, like through our provincial governments. And so, it was kind of challenging and frustrating beginning in this, but it's been really exciting to see it evolve over these years and to see where we're at and to get to that point where we're actually seeing action on the ground. So that to me is just, it's so exciting. And I grew up as my dad was a horse logger in central Ontario in Muskoka. And so I, from a young age was exposed to working in the forest ecosystem and got to learn about it through that, which was exciting, and have worked in different facets of forestry across Canada, from the East Coast to northern BC and into Saskatchewan. So I feel very fortunate that I've had those experiences. So just before I get into the actual presentation, I'd like to make our territorial acknowledgement here. And so currently I acknowledge that I live and am presenting from Treaty 6, territory and homeland of the Métis, and we pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationships with one another. I would also like to acknowledge that I currently represent and work remotely from the UBC Vancouver campus, which is on the traditional ancestral non-ceded territory of the Musqueam people. So today I want to give you kind of an introduction overview of climate change and vulnerability assessments and how they're used in sustainable forest management. And we'll focus on a Canadian context, but one of the things that I want you to keep in mind is that the framework that I'm going to show you that we use is actually very transferable. And currently this framework, I'm working with a group called the Saskatchewan Research Council, and I'm working with their diamond processing facility and with their geoanalytical lab, and they work, that's in the mining sector. So we're looking at, I'm helping them develop a prototype of an assessment that can be used in the mining sector. And this, will be something that they present. So from the diamond processing lab, they work with organizations like De Beers, Rio Tinto, Ella Rosa, and groups like that. And with the geoanalytical lab, they work with uranium and potash mining groups. So a lot with Nutrien and BHP. BHP is actually just starting a process of building a potash mine in Canada. So I think BHP hasn't gotten into potash before, so this is a new venture for them. And then Cameco with uranium. And so this framework can be used and taken it to be applied at different scales and in different sectors. So then I'm going to actually dig into an actual case study and go through the process that we completed and what some of the results were and how they're actually being applied, and hopefully have a bit of discussion with you, and then we'll wrap up. So some of the things before we get into it that I'm hoping that you can identify and take away from today's presentation is to recognize how climate change vulnerability assessments fit within socio-ecological systems. And from what I understand, some of your talks this morning really started to look into how climate vulnerability assessments work in different with different organizations at different scales, different approaches to it, considering bottom up and top down. And if you're looking at, how participatory the process is going to be. And one of the things that I always try to get across is that there's never one size that fits all. Adaptation happens at that local level. That's where the magic happens, and it needs to happen on the ground. So that local context is so important. And from my experience, when we're doing much more sort of higher level vulnerability assessments that are at larger scales, good things can come out of them. But to get the action happening, it's a little bit different process from that really local level context and seeing it be put into place on the ground. And then what I'd like you to try to do when we're going through this is identify some key elements of vulnerability assessment processes, like what you do and possible benefits from undertaking an assessment. And in this context, it's by forest managers, but you also think, with your own experience and your own context and background in other land management systems as well. So climate change. In this context, there's increasing concern for forest managers. They are actually seeing things on the ground that are affecting their practices and their operations. So there's a lot of conception that forest industry is just about the timber values and just about making money. And that is a significant part of it. I like completely. However, in the Canadian context, forestry is heavily regulated, and it's regulated under the jurisdiction of provincial governments. So we have our federal government for Canada, and then the jurisdiction of forestry on the Crown land, which is owned by the provinces, it falls under the provincial government purview. And they have a very stringent set of regulatory processes the industry has to meet in order to have a license on the land. And that is their license to operate. That's their ability to, they have certain criteria they have to meet to manage the land. And they won't maintain their license if they don't meet those. And there are fines if they don't meet them. And significant things that they don't want to have come into play because they won't be operating. The scientific evidence around climate change impacts and the different climate change scenarios that are out there definitely demonstrate that things are changing, that the things that the impacts they're already experiencing on the ground, such as increases in fire severity and frequency, drought events, more heavy precipitation events, but varied at different times of the year, seasonal changes, those types of things, they're already seeing them. They know that they're happening and that they've increased. And when you look at the climate science and the scenarios, we don't have a crystal ball, but the evidence is showing these things are just going to increase to different extremes, depending on where you're located, going forward into the future. And then this affects the ability to continue to achieve sustainable forest management practices in the future. And companies are recognizing that they need to move from being reactive to these impacts and the vulnerabilities to planned adaptation. Because reactive adaptation too causes costs. It costs even communities and things. So for example, this past summer, we had an extreme fire season in British Columbia. And in that fire season, one of the communities was completely burned to the ground, Linton, BC. And it happened so quickly. And there was no real plan in place. The plan that was there failed. And it was very reactive. And the whole season was reactive. And they have recognized these are huge costs. And these aren't just costs to business. This is cost to human lives, to communities, air quality things, public health issues. So, it starts to really build on each of these things that it's impacting. So in the Canadian context, it's been recognized at the national level that climate change has and vulnerabilities are increasingly important, and that we need to build resilience within our systems. And as I mentioned, it's already affecting these ecosystems, the way that people live within these areas, and how we operate in these systems. And as I mentioned, climate change does significantly, it will change the ecosystem. We are already seeing changes in distribution regimes, productivity, and species composition. So extreme weather is something too that's like, it's really that local context. This is where forest managers on the ground are really seeing the impact on what they do on a day-to-day basis. So with this is in Manitoba, and this forest company, they ended up having very heavy and early snowfall in mid-October. And this snowfall happened before the ground was frozen. And so it insulated. So they were operating in January, which in the Canadian prairies is quite cold. And we had, a couple weeks of close to minus 30 degrees, and they were rutting. So the equipment was like breaking through the snow, and because the soil hadn't froze, it was muddy and they were rutting in it. And that's a disturbance that you can't have. That's why we have winter harvesting. And so that was a new challenge for industry to face. And then this is the same area in Swan River, Manitoba. They have been having increased frequency and severity of heavy fall precipitation that is causing fall flooding. That's not something they're used to. They're used to typically having spring flooding, and they have built their seasons of harvest around that. So this this change in when you're getting the precipitation affects the operations, because this is when they're planning to get the wood out and get it to the mill. It significantly exceeded spring runoff, and they ended up not being able to haul wood from September to mid-December, because as you can see here on this road with the pickup truck here, you can't take a logging truck down a road like that. You would lose it. The road potentially could give way. So that, is a whole host of ecosystem issues, and also safety issues for the workers and those types of things. So this is really significant. And so this leads into the next slide. When not being able to haul wood, this is an aerial image of what their normal wood yard looks like. So you can see the stockpiles there, and this would be poplar, and it's a hardwood, and this mill makes siding out of that. And then this is what you end up with when you can't haul wood for a significant period of time. It's the empty wood yard. And this means that the mill has to do an unscheduled shutdown, which it's not only expensive and costs a great deal of money for the company, it really impacts the people, the local people that work in the community, because this is their livelihood. And when the mill's shut down, they don't get paid, they can't work, and then it affects supply chain going forward. So in forest management and climate change, in the vulnerability assessment, we look at building in, okay, what is happening with respect to climate change? What is the science saying? What are we looking at for climate variability? And then what about the uncertainty? Because, basically we're planning in the face of increasing uncertainty going forward. So with regards to sustainable forest management, how do we fit these climate vulnerability assessments into what they're already doing? Well, really, actually, in the context of their system of how they manage, a lot of this is common sense. It is already a part of how they do business. And so really this structured decision-making approach fits very well into, because it can be tailored. It's not set in stone, so you can tweak it to specifically meet the needs of the group that's doing this. So it's a structured decision-making approach that helps groups go through and identify, well, where are we noticing these changes? We bring the science into this, we bring local knowledge and understanding into this, and look at, where is our system vulnerable, where the human part of the system, but also what are the biophysical vulnerabilities that are happening on our landscape? And then how do these feed into our system, the human parts of our system, and make that vulnerable? And then looking at the combination of that, how do we rank the vulnerabilities? And then that allows us to move to the adaptation part. It's like, okay, here where we're vulnerable in these different areas, how can we start to bring our knowledge and information together to identify where we need to make adaptations to what's happening out there to help address the biophysical impacts, but also address the management vulnerabilities. How do we develop these? How do we actually build these into our system? So that's where the planning and implementation comes in. And one of the really key important things in this is to build a monitoring and evaluating program. So the framework that I have used, and so right now I have done 6 vulnerability assessments with this framework, all large at, over 2 million hectares. And then we've actually also applied it at the individual owner level for a wood lot for 20 acres, which is really small, and it works. So it's been really exciting to play around with it and do that. So, there's actually little evidence out there right now of forest managers and others in the natural resource sector to where they're actually at the point that they're implementing management strategies and changing their practice to address climate vulnerabilities and impacts. And the following case study, I'm hoping, gives you a bit better of an example of where some actual proactive adaptation is happening. This is at the forest industry scale, and it's through the use of that vulnerability assessment framework from Edwards et al. So in a Canadian context, this is the first large-scale assessment that has been done. Actually, even in a North American context, it was the first industry initiated one. So that was really exciting to be part of it. And how this all came about was in December of 2004, the provincial government of Saskatchewan and the Forest Services branch, they decided they needed to do a workshop on climate change. And but they weren't sure where to start. So they invited a bunch of industry practitioners, things to this workshop, and they went through and did like a number of different types of scenarios. Like, this is the best case, and the worst case being, the worst case, they called it the Mad Max scenario. And so I'm really dating myself here, but I don't know if any of you are familiar with, Mad Max and this sort of apocalyptic type of movies that came out years ago, but that was sort of their worst case. And what they came out of from this workshop was basically, okay, we know climate change is already affecting what we're doing out there. and affecting the ecosystems, but we really have no clue what to do. And how do we translate the science that's out there into a way that practitioners on the ground can actually relate to it? So then that's where I came in, and they contacted me because I'd been working in this area, and they said, "Hey, Sheri, what do you think about doing a project on this? Where should we start?" So identified where there were gaps between science, management, and the policy interface, and started to bring that information together, looking at both from a federal and national scale, and bringing it down to the provincial government scale and forest industry in Canada. And so then we say, okay, let's look at examining Saskatchewan's forest policy and their management objectives or options for the government, the policymakers. And, to really make this informative and useful, we need to have an industry partner in this, because we need to be able to feed up the on the ground evidence to the policymakers, to the decision makers there, so that it's really something that's going to be useful and applicable on the land and in practice. And so really, this was exciting because too, in a Canadian context, there's a real, it's kind of this power dynamic, and it's like between the regulator, the provincial governments who say, we make the rules, these are the laws, and this is what you're going to do, and industry, and they're always butting heads. So really what we had to do was first come to a place like, we're doing this collaboratively. We are trying to build a partnership here. And that is, kind of a challenging thing. You're changing mindsets here, but it was really exciting to do this. And ultimately what we came out of, we developed a mainstream tools for adaptation on the ground at the industry level, but we also were able to provide recommendations and guidance for policy, and able to sit down at the same table together to share those and work through them, which, at times was really challenging, but it was overall really positive situation. So the main components of this are case study with Mystic Management Limited, and we developed recommendations for climate change, and then developed the adaptation options and tools of how to actually put this into practice. So Mystic Management Limited, to give you some context, is a woodlands management company that provides timber and forest services to its owner. So this is a really exciting example because it's 50% owned by an all Indigenous forest company. So North South Forest Products is 100% Indigenous owned, and Meadow Lake Mechanical Pulp is owned by Paper Excellence, which is an Asian conglomerate. So two very different corporate cultures and mentality there, with the First Nations being very connected to the land. And this is actually happening in their backyard. So Mystic has had the license since 1998 for the forest management agreement with the province of Saskatchewan. So just to give you an example, here's a map of Canada, and we have Saskatchewan here. And the purple area here is Mystic's forest management agreement, and that's 1.9 million hectares. So when I talk about the framework, this is the framework that we use. And I have, as I mentioned before, adapted this for different organizations and different groups, depending on the context. And in the beginning, the organizational readiness piece, we work through that. That's where you determine, do we actually have the buy-in? Do we have the ability to be able to do this, to undertake this assessment? And then phase two, we move into providing the context, which is really important because that's looking at who is the team going to be? understanding definitions, and you may not think that that's an important piece, but you are bringing people together that all have different backgrounds. And when you talk about resilience and adaptation and mitigation, there can be misconceptions or different ways that people define these terms. And so understanding the terminology that is going to be used throughout this, that everybody's on the same page as to what adaptation is, what is mitigation in this context, is really important. And then this is where we really bring in the climate science, looking at the current climate and forest conditions and the future climate and forest conditions. But we also bring in the local knowledge. So that would include the indigenous experiences on the land base, what they're encountering. That includes other stakeholder groups. We work a lot with trappers and other recreational users, communities, etc. And we make sure that we build that in, because it's not just about the science that you take from academic journals and things. It's really bringing the combination together that really informs and makes a strong vulnerability assessment. And this phase 2 is like, think of building a house, okay? You need a strong surface or a strong foundation to build your walls on. This is the foundation of the vulnerability assessment. And if you don't have a strong foundation, your walls are going to be shaky as you move forward. So when you move into phase 3, that's where you really dig in and assess, like look at the biophysical elements of your system. So when you're doing this on any type of an ecosystem, and then you look at the human parts of the management on that system. So in a forestry context, that's the sustainable forest management objectives. And how vulnerable are they to be able to continue to achieve sustainability in these individual objectives going forward under these increasing impacts of climate change? And then you rank your vulnerabilities there. And then phase 4, you identify and evaluate adaptation, and then look to what parts of the system can we start to implement and mainstream adaptation into. So in this example, we did a vulnerability assessment that looked at both current and future risks of MSC's system using the guidebook. And as I mentioned, we did the biophysical and the management aspects. We also did an assessment of looking at their response to the past, the present, and future climate-related impacts. So we assessed their adaptive capacity here. And that is a really key part, because some vulnerability assessment frameworks don't really build this in, or they don't go deep enough. And this is something that in work that I'm continuing to do that we're expanding on. And this is really where those social determinants come in. And, you know, in a lot of ways, that's a new concept for people, because sometimes that's really challenging to quantify. And it can be very subjective. And as I mentioned, M.Sc is the first forest company to do this. So from M.Sc's perspective, and this was from the core team, they felt that these were the top 4 benefits from doing the vulnerability assessment, was to allow them to demonstrate to the public that they were taking a proactive approach to addressing climate change issues. And in this, it wasn't just saying, oh, we're doing this, so we're good. It was like, okay, we're doing this. This is what we're recognizing. This is where we're at. And these are some of the issues that we're facing, and actually getting the public to weigh in on it, which was an exciting piece of this. It also, they felt, increased their ability to more comprehensively address species at risk concerns within their forest management agreement area, which is a big thing for them. Increase their confidence in best practices for both the mills. So the mills need to be confident that what M.Sc is doing out there is going to continue to keep the forest growing and healthy and also producing. It also helped increase the confidence of being proactive in the auditing process. So they have third-party independent certification, and they get audited on the certification every year. So Mystic is CSA and FSC certified, and this allows them to be able to sell their products to certain markets out there. So some of the key highlights, they were the first, they have successfully completed this with an industry government collaboration, which we all know can be challenging. They have successful mainstreaming underway. They've already, been going through and building more adaptations into their system. It's increased their adaptive capacity for both the government and industry to better address these issues, because they actually have an understanding now of where the vulnerabilities are. And it's also really made progress in the Indigenous and other stakeholders' awareness and understanding of climate science, but also bringing them into the engagement process and moving beyond this idea of just consulting to actually building more relationship building and engagement, which is, something that we know everywhere that is needed. So some of the tools that they have used in this context include their certification pieces, which I mentioned. They have ISO, so their internal standard operating procedures. We took each one of those apart and looked at where a climate piece could fit in. They also have an annual report that they have built a climate piece into to report on. And they've also included this in their longer term planning into their 20-year forest management plan. And this is actually a regulatory requirement by the provincial government. So they've built that into their 2019. They just renewed it in 2019. They've built it into volume 3. And just to give you an example, they have included 2 different things that they've already been working on now for 3 years. They've been monitoring the number of days frozen for 3 important lakes in their forest management area. And they've also been monitoring operational days lost due to abnormal weather and environmental conditions. So for looking at the 3 lakes, these are very important to local people. And so they've actually involved local people in the monitoring. And each lake is being monitored for ice conditions and ice thickness. And so they're reporting on this annually, and it's actually giving them some real baseline data that's very locally relevant. And what they're finding is that in the trend over time, they actually are seeing a decline in the total number of frozen days per year. This impacts the local people, but this also feeds up into looking at and correlating it with the climate science out there and different weather information. For the operational days lost due to weather and environmental conditions, they are looking at how many days have been lost during normal operations, taking out any non-climatic factors, and just looking at, what are the climate related days lost. So for example, often in the summer months, and this happened this year, there's shutdowns that occur due to ground conditions being too wet or the fire hazard being too high to operate. And then in the winter, harvesting or hauling will have to stop if the temperatures get too warm. So for example, last year's winter, of 2021, in January, February, we had a lot of mild weather, and it was going from one extreme to the other. And so it was really wreaking havoc with things like winter roads. So a lot of times you do winter roads because it's less impact into the forest. And they weren't getting those really cold days to make those snow and ice roads. Hauling also in Saskatchewan context, there's weight limits on different classes of road systems, and the full weight permits during the winter are very weather dependent. And so the increasing variability with freezing and thawing caused it to affect the haul. And that means less wood is coming out of the bush. So it's sitting in there, it's ready to come out, but they can't access it. In the summer, harvesting shut down. We looked at harvesting shut down for X number of days due to the high fire, as I mentioned. And then the other parameter was the number of times a harvesting operation had to be moved to an alternate area because one site was too wet to operate in. For the winter matrix, we looked at shut down for X days due to warm temperatures. And then the haul reverts on X number of days to non-permit dates. So this is a quote from Nishka Hobson, who is the Sustainable Forest Management Planner. And she said, you know, this has really done a lot for building capacity within the organization, but it's also helped build a commitment to working on implementing additional tools that they've identified that they need and adaptation options by doing this. Because before they started, they like nothing was formalized, you know, they'd been seeing things out there and reacting to it. But by doing this puts them in a whole other place by being able to plan. I mean, you're always going to have that reaction for certain things, but they're much more informed and better prepared for what's happening out there. So for some of the key takeaways, I'm hoping that you got out of this was to recognize how climate change vulnerability assessments fit within SFM systems, but not just for these types of systems, for any type of land management system, how they can be of value. And as I mentioned, by doing this, Mystics increased its awareness, its understanding, and its adaptive capacity. They've also identified what do we need to mainstream? How do we start to build this into our existing system? It's not about reinventing the wheel. It's about looking at that existing system and how can we fit these pieces in? Because then it doesn't seem so overwhelming. If I went to them and said, oh, you know, your whole system needs to be scrapped, we need to rebuild it, and it's got to have this climate focus and all of that, too overwhelming, I would have gotten zero buy-in from them. So it's like, okay, let's look at the system. There are some great components to this system. Sustainability is a key part of this because they want to continue to be there. And, you know, speaking from my own experience as a forester, first, I went into this business because I love the forest. It's important. I want it to be there. I want it to be managed in a sustainable, healthy way. So this is how foresters that I work with anyways, for the most part, perceive this. So they want to do this. So it's like a lot of times it's more the way you approach this with groups to get that buy-in. And then they can see the benefit in this. And they took a lead role with the province. And we're in the process of helping build more flexibility into policy and that regulatory environment. And, you know, this isn't just a benefit to the government or to industry. It's also a benefit to other stakeholders and communities, because we're looking at things of how to build capacity for communities. So a lot of communities in these areas have challenges with financial resources and adaptive capacity. And so it's allowed Mystic to work with them to do things like fire smarting their community and helping increase access issues. Like some of these communities get a lot of road washouts and they're very northern and remote. So if you lose your only road in and out of the community, that's a real challenge. That's, a challenge for medical personnel to get in there, all those types of things. So by working together and doing this process, this has been just such a, it's taken on a life of its own, how it's expanded. So it's really exciting to see that. So I think that, there's a real role for climate vulnerability assessments, and adaptation is needed on the ground. And, for in the forestry context, these are actually critical things to help meet certification requirements. So the Sustainable Forestry Initiative has just developed an objective that anybody who's certified them has to meet. And it's called Climate Smart Forestry. And they have to address mitigation, which is, decreasing your greenhouse gas emissions and basically your carbon footprint. But they also have to address, they have to show that they have identified their climate vulnerabilities on the land base and in their systems, both the biophysical and the human parts. And then how are they actually going to address this? What is their plan? So this is really important, from the government end of things and increasing regulatory requirements to have a social license to operate, be acceptable to the public. And also with, I'm not sure if you're familiar with ESGs, but around environmental, social, and governance pieces and investment. This is becoming something through climate-related financial accounting that, not just the forest sector is going to have to do. They're going to have to do this for mining and other types of land management. And so I just wanted to throw in, this is one of the teams of horses that my dad had. This is Tuffy and Ted. And this is actually in my parents' backyard. They have 20 acres and a load of logs on the sleighs that they were pulling out of the bush. And yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell. Sorry, I've thrown a lot at you. I get really excited about this, so I kind of talk too much, so I apologize for that. But I will stop sharing, and yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions if I can.
Great. Thanks very much, Sheri, for sharing that experience. It's really great to hear how much you've included a lot of the issues that we've been discussing in the class, and I think Marika's also been discussing with the students beforehand in your vulnerability assessments. So I think the students did a little kind of pros and cons for each of the case studies they looked at today, and I think yours has probably got a lot of pros and a bit less of the cons. So it's lovely to see that. And it comes with the passion that you have for the environment and for the system as well. But I'm going to hand over to Michelle, and Michelle's just going to facilitate the Q&A session, and I can see there's a hand up already. So we'll get on with that, not to keep everyone too long. But thank you.
Thanks so much, Fiona. So I see that there's a hand up already. So if you, in terms of questions, you can raise your hand, or if you'd prefer, you could also just type your question into the chat box, and I'll keep an eye on it and read those out if you'd like. But let's go over to Kalia, who has her hand up at the moment.
Hi, Sheri. Can you hear me all right? I had some audio issues earlier today. Okay. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really interesting and great to see sort of, actual case study and how these vulnerabilities assessments work in practice. And one of the things I was wondering about both on and organizational level with the vulnerability and adaptation assessment. You can't hear me? No, okay.
I didn't actually hear your question part.
Sorry, Kalia, could you maybe type your question into the chat box? There just seems to be some issue with your audio there. And then while she's doing that, maybe we can just hop to Andrea, who has her hand up now, and then I'll read Kalia's question out.
Okay. Thanks, Sheri. Yeah, really, really interesting to hear about a very, very different part of the world as well. And there's no part of me that can imagine minus 30 degrees. But I think maybe I missed it towards the end there, because the question I had in the back of my mind is whether this has been escalated to maybe other states and into government policy. Were you saying that climate smart forestry has now kind of mainstreamed these approaches into the way companies get permits? Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, okay. So with the climate smart forestry, that is through the certification body. So it's an independent third-party certification body, not connected to government or anything. But what the certification bodies do is industry has to have some type of certification, or they can't access the markets that they need to get their products out there. So in a Canadian context, actually SFI, the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, is one of the largest certifying bodies. And they're the ones that have just introduced this climate smart forestry. So it's new and it's coming online in 2022. So industry, you know, even if the governments are not requiring things built into the regulatory pieces yet, they're going to have to do it anyway, because they've got to keep their certification or they can't get to market. So that's a really exciting initiative. And this is expanding. So all SFI certified companies are going to have this. And that's across Canada. That's really large scale. So what is really exciting, so this started in Saskatchewan. I've done this for 2 more companies in Saskatchewan, done this in Manitoba for the main forest company in Manitoba. And now I'm actually doing this I've just started it in Alberta and BC. So, you know, I feel like I should get a map and put some pins in it with the companies' names. But in the BC context, what is so exciting too, is that I'm just starting work with the Office of the Chief Forester there. And BC is going to be changing their whole regulatory requirements and building this landscape level planning process. And so it's much more holistic. And this assessment framework fits in so well with us. So they've actually asked me to be part of 4 large scale pilots that they're doing. And we're building the climate vulnerability and adaptation piece into that. So it's there's no choice. Like it's going to be part of business as usual. So it's really exciting to see this momentum, but it's also happening in different parts of the US. And I have some colleagues, especially like in the Western US, because the US Forest Service has a lot more crown land there. Whereas as you move east across both Canada and the US, there's a lot more private land than crown land. So, but yeah, there's a real momentum here, and it's exciting to see this starting. And it's exciting to see that, you know, industry is actually leading the way. It's not government, it's industry. And that's, in some ways, that's a real shift, right? So, I mean, it's got a long way to go, but it's feeding back up into the policy.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrea. So the question from Kalia being, having worked on the local or organizational level with vulnerability and adaptation assessments, and then worked on the country level, has there been a level of detail you have had to compromise on? And if so, how do you ensure that you don't lose sight of the local level, which is where the vulnerability exists and the adaptation interventions occur?
Yeah, that's really, it's a balancing act, right? And that's a challenging piece. I have worked on those different levels, and from the experiences that I've had at the national level, they don't necessarily focus on the local level vulnerabilities in that. What they do is it's more of focusing on regional, and it's looking at, okay, these different regions, these are some of the vulnerabilities from the biophysical end that we're seeing. And these are some of the things at a high level that we can do. But really so they'll build in capacity that way to help build capacity for the regions. And then it's up to the regions to take that and try to feed it down to that really local level. There can always be things that slip through the cracks and that, but I guess the way that I look at it is we have to start somewhere. And so not starting anywhere is the worst thing that we can do. So we start somewhere and we build from there.
Thanks so much. There was, Kalia just had a kind of an extra bit, just also asking how you dealt with the potential conflict when you're working with very different stakeholders that might have irreconcilable values. So maybe once you've answered that, we can have Shiona has got her hand up, and then I think we might be out of time. But yeah, if you could maybe answer that, and then I'll go on to Shiona.
Okay. Yeah, that's a real challenge. And we do have those situations all the time. One of the things that I have found to be very valuable when I start the process, I actually go and meet with the individual groups that are going to be involved in the assessment first, just myself, because I'm an independent party. I'm not there representing, I'm not there for industry. I'm not there for government. I'm there for the assessment. And that's, why they bring me in. So I go and I say, what are you recognizing? What are your values? And this is what you're seeing. So I start off by trying, you may think this is silly, but I try to create a safe space where people can be free to share their feelings and values before I bring them together, so that there's not automatically a confrontational attitude. And I try to understand where some of the challenges are in the relationships before I go in there. And then I work with a small core team to say, okay, these are the issues, these are the challenges we're already facing. Climate change aside, this is the human part of this that's going to be challenging. Let's develop a communication strategy. Let's come up with, this is actually what we're trying to accomplish. And, we will have to come to places of compromise, but, trying to set a much more collaborative stage to it. And, you're always going to have those issues, but I have found by doing that, we've come to some tough spots where people have walked away from the table. Then it's like, okay, walk away, take a breath, and then let's regroup and come back here. And where is the sticking point? What are we really stuck on here? And how do we find a way forward? So just more trying to work through those challenges that way.
Great, thank you. Shiona?
Thanks, Michelle. Mine is just a more of a question of curiosity from someone who works in Canadian forests. The whole pine beetle story, is that a major challenge, and is that related to climate change? I mean, I've read it is and it isn't, there's kind of mixed reviews. So what's the latest update on the pine beetle story? Thanks.
So yes, actually the mountain pine beetle situation in Western Canada is, we've always had it, but it's been one of those things that's just cyclic and part of like the disturbance regime in the forest. But with climate change, it has been beneficial for the pine beetle's life cycle. And so with the temperature changes, we're not getting the die-off in their life cycle. So it's just caused this balloon in the population. which just went rampant across BC. And there was nothing like, forests were being just devastated. And so there was this huge push in BC, that very reactive, okay, because they weren't prepared for it. So it's like, we have to harvest as many affected trees as we can, as fast as we can, to try to stop the spread. And so it was this massive harvest, like, and mills ramped up, and this huge onslaught of wood coming off the bush. But I mean, it had to come out because it also creates a fire hazard. It creates, the opportunity for the beetles to spread. So that's something that they're still grappling with. It's more under control now, but there's a perfect example of not being prepared and being reactive. And now, there's other issues that they've got to deal with because of the way that they handled that. And then mountain pine beetle, it has spread into Alberta. It hasn't spread to Saskatchewan yet, because as you move east, the pine are becoming more patchy. So there's greater distances between the stands. So it's more challenging for the beetles to transfer.
Great, thanks for that.
Thanks. Unless there are any other pressing questions, now's your time. Otherwise, I'd just like to say thanks again, Sheri, for a really interesting talk. Like Shiona said on the chat, there will be a recording on YouTube to access. And I'm sure, I don't know, Sheri, if you're happy, perhaps we can say that if anybody does have any pressing questions, they can kind of contact you or email you to chat further.
Oh, most definitely. Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sheri. Just on behalf of we have a few other people here, but on behalf of the ACDI Masters class, thank you very much for taking the time early in the morning to give this to us. It worked out really well, bringing up a lot of the issues we discussed in class today. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. Take care, everyone.
You have a great Tuesday.
Thank you. Thanks.